Okay, let's give people, this is Chip Cleary back again. Let's give folks just one more minute to join, and then we'll get started discussing training for results. Okay, why don't we go ahead and jump in. This is Chip Cleary with Kineo. Just let me start out today by saying thanks for joining. Looking forward to the conversation, and just give a brief introduction to what we'll be sharing today. So today we're talking about how to deliver meaningful results back to the business. Now, that headline is not new news. That's what we've all been working on for quite a long time in this field. It's an old problem. How can we ensure that the investments that our organizations make in learning actually deliver meaningful results back to the business? What we'll try to do today is share some fresh thinking we've been doing at Kineo on how to solve that, how to crack that nut, how to solve that problem. To give you just a heads up on who's here today with Kineo. Oops, back up a little bit. I'm Chip Cleary. I'm with Kineo US. I'm our Vice President of Design Solutions and Consulting, and I'll be guiding us through the conversation today. We also have Victoria Simpson. So Victoria will help out too, as we'll be running some polls and taking some questions as we get into the conversation. Just how. Oh, want to say hi, Victoria?
Hi, yes, good morning. Just wanted to say hello to everybody and thank you.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So Victoria's our master of ceremonies. So what we'll do is we'll go through this. Please like it to be interactive, so chime in with your questions and comments. You can use the question feature. So congrats, we have our first one, which says Victoria is hard to hear. So Victoria, when you chime in, please pipe up. So please feel free to jump in with that. Victoria will be monitoring that. There'll be a couple points in the discussion where we'll pause, and then Victoria, if there's a question that seems particularly appropriate to tackle right away, please feel free to jump in and we'll cover that. So that's enough for how we'll run the session. Why don't we get into the meat of it? So here's the problem that set us to thinking. We're at a point in learning and development where we've never had so many arrows in our quiver for how we can solve business problems with learning solutions. We have new technologies come on board every month, it seems. We have improved methods for instructional design. We have all sorts of options for how we can fix problems. But at the same point, when you step back and you ask, well, does that mean that our business sponsors are seeing increased value every year and are entirely sold on what we do as a group? Unfortunately, sometimes the news isn't as optimistic as we'd like to be. So here's some of the data that we've seen. Surveys like this come out every year. 25% of CEOs say that their training programs aren't effectively, or only 25% say that their programs are effective at measurably improving performance. Only 24% of senior executives feel that their organization's training is really tightly aligned to their strategy. A desire for more data about just what are the results that we're producing after all. So, while we have more tools and more approaches, it's not necessarily clear that those are enabling us to systematically do better at solving business problems with investments in learning. Now, before we get into it, let me just ask for a poll from the audience. If you think about your organization and how your business leaders evaluate and think of who you are, Virginia, let me ask you to run the poll. Do they view L&D as a trusted advisor who's helping them solve business problems? Do they view you as a valued service provider whom they can bring training problems to and you'll solve training problems technically in an efficient way? Do they not really actually think about training whatsoever? Do they actually have a negative opinion? Oh, those training guys, they're really disconnected and they speak a funny language, or gosh, I hate dealing with them. They're just simply unhelpful. So let me give you just 30 seconds for you to answer the poll and see where we land on that before we jump further into the conversation. Maybe just a few more seconds, 10 more seconds, they're all. Okay. All right, well, let's pause. Okay. And then Virginia, why don't you share back? What are the results of the poll?
We have 40% of our listeners are saying they are a valued service provider. So the business leaders are seeing them as a valued service provider. And then the rest of the, another 60% are divided equally between trusted advisor, training who, and disconnected.
Yeah,
so
that's great.
Yeah, that's pretty evenly split.
Well, thanks.
Between the rest of the options.
Yeah, and that's actually, those numbers tend to be higher than typically the numbers I'm used to. Now I'm typically used to numbers coming from the US, so it's a bit different audience. But kudos to the group. Usually see a little bit more weighting towards the bottom of the screen rather than the top of the screen. So kudos. You know, what we'll try to share today is some ways to further sharpen that. You know, and the fundamental, when we sat back and said, you know, why is it that numbers like I shared before, you know, crop up year after year? You know, we think part of that is because oftentimes when we're in L&D, you know, we set our sights on providing a really great training solution. And oftentimes that means that we will launch a training program for an audience, and then we'll hope that we supported the business outcome. And that hope can have several forms. We hope that people will go back and apply this on the job. We hope that they'll actually get organizational support for it. We hope that we've understood the activities and the needs correctly. And, you know, simply put, hope's not a method. And so, you know, part of we'll argue for today is to take a little bit broader view of what in fact is our responsibility. And is it enough for us to pause and feel satisfied that we've provided a great training solution? Or should we really be reaching beyond and not being satisfied until we've demonstrated that we've reached the result that we're seeking? And what we'll argue today is that a lot of our effort goes into managing and doing our best to provide great training activities. And relatively little of it actually comes to making sure that those activities are making a business outcome, are making for a business result. So we'll share some thinking we've been doing about how we can make that happen. That thinking will be broken into 3 clusters of ideas. The first cluster of idea is around what we call designing journeys. And I'll describe what I mean by that, but that's taking sort of a broader view of what we're providing, not stopping with a training activity, but embedding practice and application and results into the programs that we offer. A second part of that will be how can we deliver more efficiently? And so how can we use that quiver of arrows that we have to be able to use the right solutions at the right time? And how can we think about that? And then the third has to do with not so much how do we design programs, but how do we choose what we want to cover in the first place? And how do we really focus on the small amounts of content that will have the largest impact in the field? And the number of mistakes that happen in the field that will have the biggest impact on the business result. So we'll jump in and we'll cover each of those 3 areas. Let me go ahead and get started with the first one, design journeys. And just give an example. So imagine we're in an organization, our leadership wants to improve the quality of the work the organization's doing. I'm sitting in learning and development. We've done some great performance consulting. We've determined that really the key issue among everything else that we could do, if we can help our frontline leaders set expectations more effectively, that's going to enable our teams to really improve the quality of what they're producing. Sounds good. Now what happens? And you know, here we're arguing for a shift in perspective. In kind of a traditional approach, the L&D organization might say, well, what's our mission? Well, we're going to train you. Then we may actually quiz you to see whether or not you got it. We're going to take on our backs the responsibility to make sure that the training we gives you the skill that you need. You know, we're going to hope that we send you then back to the job and you use what we've given you. You know, when we're running this process, we kind of view ourselves as being in charge of it. We're taking care of making sure you're getting the training you need. And, you know, often we're really not that clear of what happens after we release you from our great training activities back to the field. And, you know, we're arguing that, well, instead, let's broaden our perspective. Let's take that to, our goal really isn't to train you or not to train you. We want you to be able to demonstrate proficiency. In order to make that happen, we're actually going to use the line of business and say, between you and your manager, you're going to rate how well you actually do that. When we're providing learning activities and training, our goal for that isn't to give you all the skill that you need. We think you're actually going to have to apply things on the job. We're going to prepare you to give that practice. So really deliberate practice and making sure that you're ready to try it in the field and learn from that is the heart of what we want to happen. And we're going to set up a system in which you and your manager will be in charge of this journey you'll take, but we'll provide you the support to make it simple. We'll provide you the materials that will make it, that will enable you to succeed in it. And the whole process will have accountability and run on documented results. So what we're striving for is a shift from let's provide the activity of training to let's provide a system in which the organization can demonstrate results. Now, we call that proficiency journeys, learning solutions that lead to demonstrated results. To give you just a picture in your mind of what that might look like. We actually think that in every organization, there are some go-getters who kind of do this naturally. So imagine that in this organization, there may be somebody who is a frontline manager, Sue, who realizes that she needs to set expectations better. And regardless of what we do, if Sue's really one of the 5% of the go-getters, if she's a rock star, she may decide to solve that problem herself. And what we've realized is that when people go out to solve that problem for themselves, there's often a replicable process that they follow. So Sue, the rock star, she might go and talk to some of her frontline or her team to say, how do I do in setting expectations? What works for you? What doesn't work for you? What could I do better? And so from that insight, she may learn, in fact, she's got some key issues. Or she may diagnose her issue that she actually doesn't really know what a good set of expectations might look like. Having had that diagnosis, she may go hunt in the world for some resources and run across something like the SMART framework to say, oh, now I understand what I should do with expectations. I should make sure they're specific, measurable, achievable, and the rest. And, with that, she may then say, oh, well, let me try to apply that. She may spend a couple weeks saying, let me actually use the SMART framework to set expectations and see how far it gets me. After a couple weeks, she'll sit back and say, how's that working for me? And then she may actually realize, SMART gets me pretty far, but it really doesn't get me far enough because I realized that once I've set up the expectations, I need to check on them, and SMART doesn't really help me with the monitoring process. I've learned a lesson. So now let me try to apply that for a couple weeks and again assess where I am. So if Sue's really a go-getter, she might take herself on that kind of learning journey. What we think we can do is copy what go-getters like Sue does. We can't expect everybody to behave like that, but we can actually provide guardrails that lead the large proportion of people to go through this kind of process that the most proactive learners naturally tackle for themselves. And so we think we can guide you through a journey like that. To give you a sense of what that might look like, I'll just guide you through a little bit of a solution. It's called Management Plus that we're bringing to market now that uses this idea in the domain of frontline manager skills. So in this example, we have Frank, who's another frontline manager. He's a team lead, and his boss, Julia, district manager. So we want Frank to become proficient at setting expectations. How can we do that? Well, the first thing to do is before we say, okay, Frank, you need to learn this skill, let's not start there and train you up. Let's have Frank think about what he really needs. So let's have him reflect on his experience. We may have him go out and do what Sarah did, interview some of his team members and see what's going on. So Frank can begin to get a sense for himself. Where am I strong? Where do I need to improve in setting expectations? We might follow that up with some diagnostic activity. So provide a series of best practices in how to set expectations. And ask, how often do you do the following things? And share the results back. Oh, okay, well, I'm actually pretty good at setting expectations when I give new work. I'm not so good when a new team member joins. I'm actually pretty good at following up. I'm not so good at ensuring accountability. So again, helping Frank determine what specifically does Frank need to work on in setting expectations. Once we're at the point where now Frank says, gosh, I have a need to get better at this, and I actually have a sense of where I want to get better, well, then Frank's now going to be an eager adult learner. So we can go ahead and provide some training. And we won't say a lot about training inside this talk. many sort of talks about training before, and I think the field as a whole is really pretty strong about how do we support a great training activity. So, after we come out of training, though, we're not done. We'd really like Frank to go back and apply this in the field. And so what we can ask him is to say, over the course of the next couple of weeks, pick 3 people from your team, and we'd like you to go apply these skills. And here's where we find really what we call the learning doing gap often jumps up. If I put myself in Frank's shoes, you may have just given me a model for how I can set expectations. I'm not used to that model. It's going to feel weird and uncomfortable when I go and try to apply that in the field. I'm probably going to need some impetus to actually do that. And so, excuse me, just took a drink. And so what we do when we provide for that is we say, let's have you go and do that. Let's give you a little 2-page guide that will lead you through the process. Okay, when you go and set expectations, who do you pick? Work through the model to prepare yourself, remember the steps of the journey, and then when you're done, reflect on that a little bit. And in fact, those reflections we ask you to share back with your manager. And that encourages you to apply in the field, but it provides you a simple little cycle. Prepare, do, reflect, that you can become experienced from your application. And then finally, when you come back to that, after you do each of those applications, you can think through and reflect, how did that work for me? Share that. In Management Plus, we actually share your reflections between you and your direct manager, so we're forming a learning partnership. And then based on that, we can say after you've done a little bit of practice, let's step back and assess, where are you? How far have you gained in the distance you've come in running this journey? And so between you and your manager, do you feel at this point you've actually gained sufficient skill in how to set expectations? If not, let's decide what further steps you should take. If you are, great, we've actually achieved your goal, and based on how you demonstrated proficiency by actually practicing your team, we can sign you off as being skilled in this. So that's a quick sort of chef's tour about when we're talking about using the idea of a journey, how we're expanding beyond simply providing the training activity to provide something in which we make sure that we engage, we diagnose, we help the participant learn, we have a structured way of helping them apply, and then we help them assess to make sure that we've gotten to the place we want to be before we consider ourselves done with it, and how we leverage the partnership between the participant and their manager as we go along on that journey. So that's one example of a proficiency journey. I want to just make the point that that example is pretty intensive. We actually think that tackling frontline managers and the size of the learning doing gap there's a fair number of gaps which prevent frontline managers from necessarily applying training. So we need to put a fair amount of structure in place to tackle that. That doesn't mean that we think this is the right answer for every problem. So we think the framework is useful, but just to quickly work through a second problem. Let's see, how would you apply the same set of ideas in a different context? In this case, let's imagine that the business goal is to improve information security. Again, you've done some great performance consulting to understand really what the underlying problem is. And that really what we want to do with the organization is just make sure the entire staff becomes aware of a few pretty common risks, like, for example, don't pick up USB sticks you find in the parking lot and plug them into your computer, and take some simple steps to ensure information security. Change your password every 30 days. Great. Well, how are we going to use these ideas to tackle that problem? Well, if you think about the steps: engage, diagnose, learn, apply, and assess, really, here, the huge problem is engaging participants. How can we engage participants? The learning is really pretty simple. There's a series of 5 best practices. We want you to become aware of how important they are. So really, if we tackle the engagement problem, we're 85% of the way done. Well, if we're going to do that, then we're going to put our weight behind engagement. Well, how might we tackle that? Well, this is an example that we work with one company that really was about providing what we called a campaign that said, let's use some kind of tongue-in-cheek ways that we can reach out to the audience. So we put all the weight behind engaging, where we created the campaign. We invented a couple of characters, Barkley and Fisk, who are the superheroes whose job it is to improve information security in a fictitious company. We had movie posters that featured them. We had information. We had an information campaign that had mugs that went out to people. A series of sort of promotions. There were tip cards that went up on cafeteria tables, a contest where you could win an iPad, intranet announcements that really just reinforced this notion of Barclay and Fisk are out there improving information security. And each one of those things led to a little video that led to one of the 5 or 6 core ideas on how to improve information security. So over time, by running this campaign over the period of a number of weeks, we're able to draw people in to say, okay, actually, you've sort of captured my attention, you've captured my imagination. I'm ready to hear a little bit about information security. I want to see how Barclay and Fisk are actually tackling the next problem in the vignettes that you're providing. So really, this notion of a learning journey, in some cases it's as simple as really just let's capture attention and use some techniques for that. What we found was, results that were actually quite a bit better than the organization expected, that more than a third of people afterwards, when surveyed, said that actually it's not just that they were aware of the campaign, but the campaign changed their behavior. So that represents, 86% said that they were now more aware of information security. Better than a third said that it actually changed their behavior. Same set of ideas, very different shape to the solution. So let me pause there. I'm going to move on from the notion of designing journeys to create business change. Let me just see if there's any questions that we should tackle before we move to the next chunk of the material we want to share today. Virginia, any questions we want to tackle, or should I keep pushing ahead?
So Liam asked about the figures that you mentioned in one of your first slides around the McKinsey figures and the Deloitte figures, as to whether or not they were focused on the US or whether they were
yeah, good question. Yeah, scratching my head. The Deloitte figures were global, so that I can share. I'd actually have to look and get back to you on whether the McKinsey figures were U.S. only or whether they were also global. I suspect they were global, but we can check and get back to you. So that's probably the safest bet to say. Oh, good question. Well, let me keep moving. The second chunk, they'll be a little bit briefer, is really about, well, that process that I just went to when I talked about the frontline manager example, pretty intensive. And when we think about delivering a broader experience, when we think about blended learning, there are so many things we can do, it can become quite expensive to do. And so really, there's a question of how can we make that lean? How can we do the few things that matter most to get any particular solution? And we actually think that there's a way to think about that that makes the right answers jump to the fore. And that's simply, the old adage, make sure you understand the problem before you jump to solution. And the way we've come to think about that is we take that same model of engage, diagnose, learn, apply, assess, and we say, for the problem we're tackling, where does the heft need to go? I gave you the frontline manager example, where actually there's important work to be done in each one of these stages. Very different shape and profile from the information security example, where almost all the weight needs to go in engage. So we start out by first saying, which of the buckets matter most? It can be, in some cases, all the buckets, some cases other buckets jump out. Then the second step is to begin to think about solutions. And in beginning to think about solutions, really the key there is to not start with the arrows, to not start with the technologies we have, the designs we've used before. What we like to do is think of it from almost a fresh sheet of paper. If I could do anything I wanted, budget was no hurdle. Really, what is the experience I'd want to provide? So when we're thinking about information security, for example, the place we started was, boy, if we could actually put each of you in a place where you've suffered from an information security risk, like somebody has stolen your credit card information, all because you did something silly, that would really bring it home why information security, matters. Well, we couldn't figure out how to do that, but then we could step back from that to say, but we can actually begin to create stories. And if we begin to create stories, that takes us down the idea of kind of the information superheroes path, And that led us to the Barkley and Fisk kind of story. So, sort of the 3 steps in the thinking are, first of all, for each of those, we call them legs: engage, assess, learn, so on. What's the gap that we need to tackle? Secondly, ideal world, if we could do anything we wanted, what would we want that to look like? And then what we found is once you're there, it becomes pretty simple to say, of the arrows in our quiver, which ones do we want to pull out to actually provide this in a cost-efficient, time-efficient way? And what that really is oftentimes the temptations to begin thinking of the shiny gold bricks. Boy, we have this great social collaboration platform. How can we use it? We have a great way of providing some really great scenario-based training. How will we apply that to the problem? Instead, say that's the last step. Let's actually go through the first 2 steps to get to the solution. So that is sort of the crux of delivering efficiently. Really, it's more of a bit of process. Now, let me pause on that. It looks like some questions are coming up. So let me pause. And actually, Virginia, again, if you could help me understand what are the questions, see if we can provide some answers, and then we'll move into the third and final section.
Yeah, so Les is looking at the proficiency journey, and he's asking, why would you not diagnose before you engage so that you can target the most appropriate solutions? And he's saying diagnosing at a more global rather than an individual level.
I see. Yeah, thanks for the clarification too. That helps. Yeah. So quick answer to that is absolutely. I mean, so in order to develop a solution like that frontline manager example I showed, before we, if you think of just the development process, yes, we need to do what I call the performance consulting. We need to understand what's the business problem. From that, what's the performance problem that's causing the business problem? What's the root cause of the performance problem? And so, I stopped in the story at the level of we've done the performance consulting to say setting expectations is the issue. But underneath that, what's hard about setting expectations? Why don't frontline managers set appropriate expectations? What's the gap with that? I think at the organizational level, you want to do that level of diagnosis and performance consulting and gap assessment, training needs assessment, series of words that goes by before you begin to jump to the solution. Really what I was sharing was at the individual level. If I'm now Frank, if I'm that frontline manager, actually the diagnosis really is part of the engagement. But in order to get me to buy into spending time with you, oftentimes I got a lot of things I can spend attention to, and this is simply grabbing my attention. Why is it worth me spending time with you? How is me spending time focusing on your learning solution going to save me time in the end, going to improve my performance, going to improve my team's performance in the end? So often those bits of engagement at the individual level can be quite brief, but they really need to be quite snappy. It's almost sort of the advertising message of, what's the quid pro quo? What do I get out of spending time engaging in your learning solution? The focus of that was really at the individual level. Totally agree that we want to do the organizational diagnosis before we can even create the appropriate solution. I think, please, go ahead, Virginia.
Sorry, Chip, there's just another question that kind of takes that a little bit further as well from Gemma, saying, how do you work with time constraints? The business is demanding training ASAP, but sometimes it's almost impossible to build the engagement with the little time provided.
Yeah. Well, yes, absolutely, and I'll offer some comments on that. I'm not sure they'll count as new wisdom. I think first of all, beginning to form the partnership with the business to be able to understand, what is the problem and how to solve it right, and what we can do in phase 1 and what we can do in phase 2. I do think oftentimes there's a role of simple pushing back. Here's what I can give you under these constraints. Here's what I can give you under those constraints. At the same point, I think that there's often a temptation for us to jump in and begin doing the work right away and not spending enough time understanding the shape of the problem. So, when I use this phrase performance consulting before, I think what we found is often when you jump into doing the performance consulting, what pops out is that the problem can be a lot simpler than you thought in the first place. And in fact, that's a great lead-in to the next chunk of what we're going to talk about, focusing on what matters. And so I think the next section may help address some of this for paring down what do we really need to do in order to get the business result, which is the focus of this next section. And what I'd argue is that spending that time to get the focus can really help you overall save time in the long run. So good question. I think it's a good lead into what we're going to talk about next. So let me push ahead, and I'll jump into the third section we're talking about, focusing on what matters. So this is a shift again. This is less with how do you design a great solution and more how do you really identify what you need to tackle in order to get the business result. And what we found is that there's an awfully large temptation to try to save time by working with subject matter experts in the following way. Let's identify a handful of subject matter experts who are going to be the ones who are really going to understand what skills and knowledge and attitude that we need our target population to have to solve the business problem. Let's go to them and ask them what these guys need, and then let's set to work to see how we can actually transfer what we've gotten from the subject matter experts to the target audience. I think the problem with that model is that subject matter experts actually are often not that great at understanding what the target audience actually needs to do, the few things that matter most. Subject matter experts, by the nature of being experts, have often quite forgotten what it means to be a novice or an average performer. And they often think that, they're quite proud of what they've come, the breadth of knowledge they've come to be aware of, and they'd like to share all of that. And so oftentimes when we use this sort of traditional, let's go talk to the subject matter expert model of trying to gain what's important for us to cover in a solution, we get 100-page PowerPoints, long Word documents, lengthy lists of all the things that we should cover in our solution. And given that we often have relatively little time to cover them, we end up with kind of mile-wide, inch-deep solutions. What we'd argue is coming at that from a different perspective. We'd argue coming at that from kind of something that really comes almost out of the lean and the quality movements for saying, well, if we think about what happens without any training, if we weren't to provide a solution at all, it's not that everybody does everything wrong all the time. Actually, what happens is that a bunch of people will make a bunch of mistakes. And in fact, some of those mistakes will crop up to be much more costly and much more frequent than other mistakes. So if we think about, well, if we try to identify how important is it to train on a specific task, we can say, how important is it that somebody, if they do this task well versus poorly, how much of a difference will that make to the actual business result we're trying to get? So if we go back to Frank and say, if he sets expectations well or sets expectations poorly, how much of an impact will that make to the business result? Our performance said, consulting said, quite a big deal. Well, then the next question is, well, how big is the performance gap? And we typically position that as if you think of your best performer and if you think of your typical performer, just how differently do they go about the task? With things like, for example, learning simple systems processes, sometimes that gap's not so large. For things that require a lot of judgment, it's an enormous gap. So the second question is, how big is the gap? Third question is, well, what's causing the gap? And given what's causing the gap, how much can we really solve that problem with a performance solution? And so, some things are really, they're based in skill. Setting expectations, if I don't have a good model in my mind, if I haven't had the appropriate level of practice, if I don't know how to adjust for different personalities, I'm not going to have the skill to be able to tackle that. And so I'm going to have a large performance gap. In other cases, it can be, we worked with a store about trying to do retail sales. What we found out was the managers really cared about how pretty the displays were, and that's what they talked to the line staff about. They didn't talk about selling skills. And really, we couldn't move the needle on selling because it wasn't a skills problem. They actually pretty much knew how to sell. That's just not how they were incentivized. So we couldn't move the needle with performance gap. That was more changing managers' behavior. And so, if you step back and say, out of everything we could choose to cover, let's instead, when we do our task modeling, instead say, for each task, how important is this task to the business, in fact, to the particular business goal that we're trying to perceive? What's the difference between average and expert performance, and how much can we close the gap in that performance gap by providing the learning solution, what we tend to see is some things really jump to the fore as being critical, and some things don't. So to give you a little bit of picture of what that matters, here's an example of a project we did last year with a client. This was on sales skills, and it's a little bit complicated chart. Let me describe the chart for you. First, I'll take a quick drink of water. The way this client organized their sales process is they broke it down into 36 separate decisions that you make in your sales process. The decisions are spread across phases. So the first phase is territory planning. And the first decision is, how big is my opportunity with each of the clients in my territory? And then there's a series of 6 other decisions, so 7 total decisions in territory. Then a series of decisions I make about how will I spend my time today. They call that daily planning. There's a series of decisions about what they call pilot testing, which is really if I go to a client and I offer them a trial with our solution. There's a series of decisions I make about that, so forth and so on. And what we did is we ran that analysis that we just talked about. Each of these decisions, question how important is the decision to the business result, how big is the gap, and we actually asked some questions which allowed us to determine what impact can we have on that gap. And then we kind of coded the results. And what we found out was we used the light green here to represent something that was really high impact to the business, the dark green for medium impact, and the gray for low impact. And when we come in, this client was saying, boy, we have these 36 decisions. We need a really large training solution in order to go after that. In order to cover that, we sort of were headed down the spoon the ocean path. We're going to have to spread our scope kind of evenly across those decisions. Instead, we stood back and said, well, actually, it turns out that of all the phases, pilot testing has 4 out of the total of 7 really critical decisions that you face. And we recommend that what you do is you focus your resources on the decisions that matter most. So go after those top 7 high priority ones, and then go after the next priority ones with a little bit lighter solution. And frankly, if you don't do a lot, provide kind of a light performance support approach for the gray ones, you won't be missing out on too much of the business impact because those don't have such a big business impact. So we led them through this kind of analysis. Now, if you're faced with a tight timeline, which is a little bit of the prep bridge we had into this section, you may ask, sounds great in theory, but how can I get that done in practice? And I know that we've done this kind of analysis over a period of years with different organizations, and oftentimes we've done that using fairly labor-intensive approaches where we send people out to talk to lots of people in the field, gather the data by hand. That can take a couple of months to get the data. That's not practical for a lot of projects. I think the sort of the recent thinking that has to do with how can we, I'll come back to that, but it has to do with how can we do this in a cost-efficient way. So I'll share some thoughts about cost-efficient way in a way. But really, what we're thinking about there is we're trying to dig down to, boy, for the sales phase, daily planning, for something like a decision, choosing departments to visit, we want to get not only what's important to, but specifically what should we target with the training solution. If we're going to, choosing departments to visit is a big, high-impact decision. Well, what are people literally going to do wrong? Because we can identify that, we can make a lean learning solution. So this is an example of the level of detail that we're trying to drive to with this analysis. If you're looking at the content on the right, boy, this can really, bottom out in something as simple as say, look, there's a little math you should do in your head when you're trying to make this decision, where you're trying to look not just for the one department that has the biggest opportunity, but you're trying to add up what are all the opportunities in each department. And so you should actually probably visit more departments. Typically, you'll only decide a novice will only go to one, and more experienced people will actually split their time a little bit more, put their eggs in more baskets. That's what we found out here. And once you're down that level, asking yourself, as a learning solution, how can I help people learn to do that math in their head and not make the mistake of just oversimplifying and going to a single department? Well, ideas crop up for how I can create a pretty lean learning solution that tackles that problem. And if you're able to then say, out of everything we might do across all these 36 decisions, well, let's convert that into let's tackling 50 of these critical mistakes, you're able to begin to think of how can we do this in a really targeted way? How can we create, not creating 36 hours of training for 36 decisions, but how can we create 4 hours of training that's going to cover these 40 critical mistakes or 50 critical mistakes that really matter most? And that's what we call providing targeted training impact, targeted training focus. But the key to being able to do that is to not burn all of your calendar time up front in doing the analysis. And the way we've come around to doing that is to essentially move from what was a very labor-intensive, we'll send staff out to hand collect this data by talking to a few people in the field, to instead use what we've called a crowdsourced approach, to use survey tools to help us do it. And so the graphic on the right here provides a summary for how we can go about doing that. It basically starts out, spend a little bit of time with experts, not asking them what else should we train to everybody in the field, but just laying out very clearly what are the tasks that are at hand here. That can boil down to something like, what are the 36 decisions people make in the sales process? Second step, ask the client to turn the crank to say, how can we reach out to 30 people, 50 people, 100 people, more people, to get some information from them? From that, let's construct some surveys, which is where we get the information. Say, if we've got 30 people, maybe we break the task up into 3 sets of activities, so we're not asking too many questions to any one person. And then say, let's survey you to say, of these tasks, where do people typically go wrong in the field? When they make that mistake, how costly is that mistake? And what are the specific mistakes that they make? So if we can go and run that data, we can then bring it back and do a synthesis that allows us to draw the kinds of priority graphs that you saw before. So that's the boil it down stage. And then finally, share those results back with our experts and allow them to debunk them. Because what we found is experts are great in interpreting that data, thinking of the root causes behind it. Now, what we found is that process can be really pretty quick and time efficient from our side. So that example I gave you where we showed the graphs with the sales example, that was a 2-week process from front to start, from cold start, let's start to build the task model, to mobilize the staff to run the surveys, gather the data, share it back with the experts, and get their input to say, do you buy the results or not? In fact, in these cases, there were some challenges to the data, but once we dug into the specific answers we got, the answer was, yeah, actually we have faith in the results. So that notion of using a way to move away from what are all the things the expert tells us are critical to train on, to instead using these ideas coming from kind of the lean and the quality fields to say, no, there are errors happening in the field today, and can best use the investment we're going to get from the organization, not by trying to tackle every problem in the world, but by systematically identifying what of those errors really matter most, and putting our heft behind those few errors, allow us to make the learning solution lean and targeted, and then also allow us to boil down how can we get something that makes sense in relatively restricted calendar time. So let me pause there and see what questions have come up there, and we're coming to the end of the content we had to share. So Virginia, let me turn to you and see if we have some questions.
Yeah, so Julian asks, can too many experts slow down your analysis?
Yeah, too many chefs in the kitchen. That really has to do with how you organize the use of the experts. Certainly, if you gather a group of experts together to discuss and debate what's coming out of this kind of analysis, that can take a long time. So the way we tend to run the process is we will ask our clients to identify who is the lead guy for the tasks that we've identified, and that's often broken down. It can be, for actually this part of the process, here's a lead guy. For that part of the process, here's the lead guy. And we ask our clients, please make that person God for the decisions. And then we say, would you like to have some other people play an advisory role to them? And then finally, to get the bulk of the data, we sort of reach out to the field to ask relatively little time from people to get these sort of survey responses back into the process. So by setting up kind of a tiered structure, what we do say is here's a sort of specific role that you have in the process, and what we find is under those constraints, and as long as we sort of start out with, by the way, in order for us to get this thing into the field, we have calendar timelines. So the process is this lean process where we're focusing on a few things and hitting them hard. Our goal isn't to understand everything about the world. So we really, are trying to do this kind of top 10 thinking. We find that makes it pretty efficient. And Julian, I see a question from here. Do we dare make experts stakeholders in our project? I'll ask a little bit. So I realize you can't actually speak, which is a little bit of a constraint we face. But I'll give my answer to that, and then I'd be sort of curious for your response to my answer. I actually try not to do that. I try to divvy up the roles in the following way. That for when I say stakeholder, I typically respond to business sponsor, and the business sponsor, I try to say, okay, be clear about what's the business need we're going to meet, and how will you define success? So a year from now, you say we wanted this. What are the metrics you're going to look at? We'll bring some performance consulting to the table, and we'll use subject matter experts for that. So we'll have their thinking into that says what are the tasks and the mistakes and the priorities between them that contribute to that. We'll share that back to you, Mr. Business Sponsor. You can debunk it. Rarely that happens. That's where we'll ask the subject matter experts to say, yes, you will have the stamp of approval and ability to edit that. You'll be the owner of that. We're not the owners of that. We'll run the process that allows us to efficiently and quickly reach a conclusion on that, but that's where you, the subject matter expert, will in fact be the lead. We're not calling you the stakeholder. We're calling the business sponsor the stakeholder. That's where you're the stakeholder. And then we'll be the guys who will then say, okay, great, how can we craft the learning solution and the journey that goes behind that in a way which is going to efficiently deliver change against the performance objectives that we've identified. So kind of break it down into 3 levels. Business sponsor owns the business problem. Subject matter expert owns we call it a performance model of what performance will be changed in order to get to the business problem. And we'll be the guys who own the sort of shape and design of the learning solution we put behind it to change performance. And when it comes to evaluation at the end of it, we kind of break evaluation down in the same way, which is, let's actually go get the data that the business sponsor says that they use in order to measure business impact. That's typically not things we in L&D collect, but those are things like what are sales? What's the percentage of proposals that we've issued to the field that have won? What's the deal size that go into our proposals? And we move the needle on that because that's what our business sponsor said was going to count as success. That's sort of step 1. We'll look at that data. We'll then try to correlate that with, well, in order to be able to move the needle on something like deal size, here's the decisions we said in the sales process were going to matter the most. And in fact, did we move the needle on the proficiency level inside those tasks in the field, inside the performance model that we said we're going to move? Well, okay, let's see what data we have on that. And we'll look to do something like some of the assessments you saw in the proficiency journey to get data for that. And then finally, we'll try to correlate that back into what more or less training activity data. Well, if we're moving the needle or not moving the needle, how well does that correlate with, did people take the training? Did they actually say that the training made a difference to them in their jobs? Did they have issues with the training? So what feedback are we getting from training activity? And we try to build almost a balanced scorecard that says business metrics, business sponsor level, performance metrics, did we change proficiency at the performance model level, and then sort of training activity and some of those sort of level 1 survey results at the training level to see, can we form a coherent picture of whether we made a difference here or not. So let me pause That was a lot. I see a new question popped up. Before we move on, Julian, if you'd like to type a comment in, sort of welcome the feedback about that. Okay. Now while that's happening, Victoria, I see a question. What sort of assessment tools do we suggest for systems training? Should I jump ahead to that, or where?
Yeah. So there was two questions. So there was the what sort of assessment tools do you suggest for systems training?
Yep.
And then there was another one saying if you use surveys, how do you recommend engaging people to complete them meaningful and in time?
Yeah.
Both
Great.
kind of
Okay.
link in there.
Yeah, well, so let me do the survey question first, and then I'll come back to kind of the assessment tools for systems training, where I'll have a little bit of an answer, but I'd say, I wouldn't necessarily, I'll give a little bit of thinking about that. So first, just on getting people to complete the surveys, we've had really good success with this. So, we think it's a solvable problem. I think the key to solving that problem is to not have it be, here's a survey from your friendly L&D department. Please help us out, spend some time with this. So the first sort of step in the door is really to go back to the business, to have them own the responses to the survey. And so, really some simple things. Who is the business stakeholder? Can we have them do something simple as, send out an email message saying, we're running this really important initiative and we want to make sure that we're targeted. We need you guys to pipe up to make sure it's targeted. I'm not going to give you much time to do it. Really appreciate it if you take some time out of your day to help with that. So sort of step one is to make sure that it's actually kind of using the line of business to get the credibility of why are we doing this. It's not your L&D guys asking you to do this. It's actually the head of sales for the organization. So sort of step one. Step two is to make the ask pretty minimal. So, we're not trying to ask you to go away and spend an hour answering questions for us. What we're going to do is we're going to tell you that we're going to ask for 20 minutes of you and we're going to stick to that. And I think the law of numbers comes in here. We can't actually have somebody to work through the whole task model in an hour, so you got to kind of divide and conquer. So we need enough people to take the survey out to, so we can break the task model into 4 sections and only give people, a quarter of the task model and sort of lead them through that. So that's kind of step 2. And then step 3 is we've actually found that shorter calendar time, shorter windows for the survey work better for us than longer windows. So instead of saying, gosh, let's run the thing for 2 weeks and let's tell people you got 2 weeks to do it, send you reminders as you go through it, we're at the point where we kind of run it for 3 days. Hey, we're doing this project. We really need your input. You've heard from your boss that it's important at this point. We just need 20 minutes of your time. Let's go. Can you get it done today? And then, we'll send the daily reminders. Day 1, day 2, day 3. Day 3, really last chance to get your input into it. Can we get your input into it? And what we found for that is that, we tend to get really pretty good response rates. So, we count on getting 50% response rates, which is very high by survey standards, and we typically beat that. So that's some just how we play the game with the surveys. Take a pause for a second. I'll come back to assessment tools for systems training. Really, the key, there we sort of come back to what are the business metrics for the particular systems training at hand. Oftentimes those have to do with how many errors show up in the material being entered into the system. So we'll look to the quality team. Oftentimes the organization has a quality team which is tracking those kind of errors in the first place. Second thing we'll look at is sort of support calls. So a lot of systems training is simply, can we help you become familiar enough with the new application in a rapid time so that you know how to use it. And if you don't know how to use it, there's a safety net for you. Sometimes there are champions who wander the halls answering questions. Sometimes there's a support desk. And we look, how often are people using the safety net? So we tend to do that and rely on that more than kind of surveying participants who have been through the training to say, to what extent did this training help you learn the system? We often find that we get a lot of warm fuzzies from that, but it's not as meaningful as sort of reaching out to say, well, geez, if we failed with our learning solution, how would that show up in the world? And that'll show up with quality problems in the data, and that'll show up with lots of calls for support. Are we seeing those things happen or not? In fact, one of the nice things about reaching out to the help desk for support is you can begin to say, here are what I call those critical mistakes cropping up, and do some rapid adjustments to what the learning solution is for the next batch of people to be able to tackle the things that crop up from the help desk. Great. Okay, let me pause there. Victoria, other questions we should tackle? We're beginning to run up against time.
Yeah, so I'm quite conscious that we're starting to get to at the end of our allocated hour, but we just had one question which was actually sent in before the webinar, and Sarah would like to know how companies manage or minimize all the data that often needs to be collected to show results, e.g. evaluation surveys at different levels, business metrics and anecdotal feedback, etc. And all the data takes time to gather and analyze. So if there's anything particular that you could use to bring that on.
Yeah, well, yeah, just a sort of quick answer to that. When organizations differ. When I often talk to organizations about evaluation, given this notion that you've heard me use the kind of 80-20 rule throughout what we've talked about today, I think the same thing applies to evaluation as well. It's often the case that you'll want kind of a base evaluation system that you use quite broadly to gather a bunch of data about how various training programs work. And there's a couple of platforms out in the world that help with that. So I think Knowledge Advisors Metrics That Matter is probably the best known and maybe platform for gathering kind of systematically how can we gather a broad level of data across a number of different training programs. So that can be a sort of a foundation. And then there's a few programs that call for more. And those are really the business critical programs. In most organizations, there is, we have our portfolio of investments that we manage. There's a series of programs that we manage. And each year, there's a handful of things that are really business critical. They're really at the level of this is helping the senior leadership team drive the business in the direction they want to go. And that's where we call for more. And for those things, we actually recommend allocating time. So, there it's, manually going out and understanding how does the business track this today, gathering those business metrics, digging into the performance metrics, spending some extra time on that. And that is time consuming, but I think the short answer is you don't try to do it very often. You really pick and choose which are the few programs that we want to do that for. So quick answer to that. Basic idea, technology for the broad-based solution, but that really won't help you necessarily do great linkage to business insight. Deep dive for a handful of investments that are really business critical.
Great, thank you for that answer.
Great. I see a question of, is there a recording for this? Let me actually ask. I realize this is a question I should have asked up front. Is there a recording for this that we'll provide?
Yes, I recorded at the beginning. I clicked record, so I will make that available to all those who attended later today or early tomorrow.
Excellent. And then, just up on the screen at this point, there's a link for an article on Training for Results, which reiterates some of the content we talked about. If you have questions you'd like to reach out to me directly, there's an email address. I'd welcome questions. Cool. Just like to thank everybody for joining today. I think we're just about up on time, so I'll try to be respectful of that. Really great, interesting questions, so I appreciate that. So they keep me on my toes. Very much appreciate your time, and if you do have questions, please feel free to reach out to us going forward.
Thank you, Chip, for taking time out of your evening over in Chicago to present that for us. I think it was a great webinar, and I think our attendees will take a lot from that today.
Super. Happy to do it. I'm jealous of the weather you have down there. We've got actually snow and gray skies. So appreciate the chance to talk to everybody today. Have a great day.
Thanks, Chip. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.